The silence that followed stretched between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. James stood there in his living room, the photograph of him and Marcus still clutched in his uninjured hand, waiting for my answer to a question that felt like it carried the weight of everything we'd both been avoiding for too long. "I don't want to," I said, the words coming out in a rush. I don't want to go." Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, or surprise that I'd actually said yes. He set the photograph carefully on the coffee table, face up this time, and I caught another glimpse of Marcus's radiant smile. There was something both heartbreaking and beautiful about the way James placed it there, not hiding it but not making it the center of attention either. A quiet acknowledgement that the past could coexist with whatever was happening in this moment. "Good," he said quietly, and the simple word contained multitudes. But then we were both just standing there, uncertain about what came next. The adrenaline of the emergency had faded, replaced by something more complex and harder to navigate. I was acutely aware of everything. The way the overhead lights cast harsh shadows across his face, the distant sound of rain still pattering against the windows, the fact that we were two essentially strangers who had just shared more honesty than most people manage in years of friendship. "I could make coffee," James offered, and I could hear the nervousness in his voice. "Or tea. I think I have tea." "Coffee sounds good," I said, grateful for something concrete to focus on. He nodded and headed toward the kitchen, and I followed at a careful distance, not wanting to crowd him but reluctant to let too much space open up between us. His kitchen was as spare as the living room, white cabinets, black countertops, the bare minimum of appliances, but it was clean and organized in a way that spoke to someone who took care of his space even when no one else was there to see it. "Sorry," he said, opening cabinets with one hand while trying to keep his bandaged palm elevated. "I'm not used to having company." "Here, let me," I said, moving closer when I saw him struggling with the coffee canister. Our shoulders brushed as I reached around him, and I felt him tense at the contact before deliberately relaxing. "Thanks," he murmured, and there was something in his voice that made me look at him more closely. He was studying my face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. "What?" I asked. "Nothing, He shook his head, looking almost embarrassed. "I keep expecting you to leave, to remember that you don't actually know me and decide this is all too weird." The honesty of the admission hit me squarely in the chest, because he was right. I didn't know him. A few hours ago, he'd been nothing more than the quiet guy next door, someone I passed in the hallway with polite nods and carefully maintained distance. Now I was standing in his kitchen making coffee while the ghost of his dead partner seemed to hover at the edges of our conversation. "It is weird," I said honestly, measuring coffee grounds into the filter, but not in a bad way. More like unexpected. "Unexpected," he repeated, as if testing the word. I like that better than weird. I smiled despite the nervous energy thrumming through my system. "Good, because I think this whole night has been pretty unexpected." The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with something other than the weight of everything we weren't saying. James leaned against the counter, cradling his injured hand against his chest, and I found myself cataloging details about him that I'd never had the chance to notice before. The way his hair was starting to curl slightly from the humidity, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the fact that his t-shirt had a tiny hole near the hem, as if he'd snagged it on something and never bothered to replace it. "Can I ask you something?" he said, breaking into my observations. "Sure." "Why did you knock on my door tonight?" "Really, you could have just minded your own business." It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. The easy answer was that I'd heard someone in distress and reacted instinctively. But standing there in his kitchen, surrounded by the domestic intimacy of making coffee together, I knew it was more complicated than that. "I've been watching you," I said, then immediately felt heat rise in my cheeks. That sounds creepier than I meant it to. I've noticed you. The way you come and go, always alone, the light under your door at night. I guess I recognize something familiar. Familiar how? I took a breath, surprised by my own willingness to be vulnerable. Lonely, I said simply. You looked as lonely as I felt. The words hung in the air between us, more intimate than anything we'd shared so far. James was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and recognition, and something else that made my pulse quicken. I am lonely, he said quietly. I've been lonely for so long I forgot what the alternative felt like. The coffee maker finished its cycle with a final wheeze, and I busied myself with pouring 2 mugs, grateful for something to do with my hands. But when I turned to offer him one, I found him still watching me with that same intense gaze. Thank you, he said, accepting the mug. For being honest. People don't usually admit to things like that. Things like what? Being lonely. Noticing other people's loneliness, caring enough to do something about it. He took a sip of coffee, wincing slightly when the movement pulled at his injured hand. Most people are too busy pretending they have it all figured out. I knew exactly what he meant. How many conversations had I sat through where everyone talked about their full social calendars, their weekend plans, their thriving relationships? How many times had I nodded along and made appropriate responses while feeling like I was watching life happen to other people through bulletproof glass? I'm tired of pretending, I said, surprising myself with the admission. What would you do if you stopped pretending? The question caught me off guard, partly because it was so direct and partly because I realized I didn't have a ready answer. What would I do if I stopped pretending to be fine with my isolated existence? What would I do if I admitted that I wanted more connection, more intimacy, more of whatever this feeling was that had sparked to life between James and me in the space of a few hours? I don't know, I said honestly. I've been pretending for so long I'm not sure what's underneath anymore. James nodded as if this made perfect sense to him. I used to know exactly who I was, he said quietly. Marcus and I, we had this whole life planned out. Where we'd travel, what kind of house we'd buy, whether we'd get a dog or a cat. All these little details that seemed so important. He stared down into his coffee mug. And then he got sick. And suddenly none of it mattered. All that planning, all those dreams, gone. What's it like? I asked, then immediately regretted the question. Sorry, that's too personal. No, it's... He looked up at me, and there was something almost relieved in his expression. No one ever asks me that. They ask how I'm doing, or if I need anything, but they don't ask what it's actually like. I waited, sensing that he needed space to find the words. It's like having a phantom limb, he said finally. You know how people who lose an arm or a leg still feel it sometimes? Still reach for things with a hand that isn't there anymore? That's what grief is like. You keep turning to share something with someone who isn't there. You wake up and for just a second you forget, and then you remember all over again. The raw honesty of it hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to say something meaningful, something that would acknowledge the magnitude of his loss without diminishing it with empty comfort. But what do you say to someone who's describing the architecture of heartbreak? I'm sorry, I said, and meant it more deeply than I'd ever meant those words before. The worst part, James continued, as if he hadn't heard me, is how everyone expects you to get over it. Move on. Start dating again. As if love is interchangeable. As if losing Marcus was like losing a job or a pet instead of losing half of who I was. I thought about the picture frame he'd dropped, the photograph now sitting on his coffee table. 5 years of carrying that image around, 5 years of trying to hold on to something that everyone else thought he should let go of. Maybe it's not about getting over it, I said carefully. Maybe it's about learning to carry it differently. He looked at me with surprise, as if I'd said something unexpected. What do you mean? I struggled to put the thought into words. I don't know exactly. But maybe the love doesn't have to go away. Maybe it just changes shape, becomes something you carry with you instead of something that carries you. James was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it contained answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask. I've never thought about it like that, he said finally. I don't know anything about grief, I admitted. Not real grief anyway, but I know what it's like to feel like you're stuck in one version of yourself and can't figure out how to become someone different. Is that how you feel? Stuck. The question was so direct, so genuinely curious, that I found myself answering without the usual filters and deflections. Yeah, I said. I moved here thinking geography would solve everything. New city, new job, new life. But I brought all my old fears with me, all my old ways of keeping people at a distance. What are you afraid of? The words came out before I could stop them. Being seen. Really seen. I mean, not just the version of myself I think people want to meet. I'm afraid that if someone really knew me, they'd realize I'm not worth the effort. The confession hung between us, raw and vulnerable, and more honest than I'd been with anyone in years. James was looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between recognition and something that might have been tenderness. I see you, he said quietly, and the simple words hit me with unexpected force. You don't know me. Maybe not all of you. But I see the part that knocked on my door tonight, the part that stayed to help with my hand, who listened when I told you about Marcus, who's sitting in my kitchen at midnight drinking coffee and telling the truth about being lonely. He paused, his gaze steady on mine. I see someone who's brave enough to care about a stranger. Something in my chest loosened at his words, a knot of self-doubt that had been there so long I'd forgotten it was possible to untie it. I don't feel brave, I said. Brave people usually don't. We finished our coffee in comfortable silence, and I found myself reluctant to suggest that we move back to the living room. The kitchen felt safe somehow, contained and intimate in a way that made the rest of the world feel very far away. But eventually James set down his empty mug and looked at me with a question in his eyes. We could watch something, he offered, if you want to stay a while longer. I nodded, following him back to the living room where the photograph of him and Marcus seemed to catch the light from the overhead fixtures. James noticed me looking at it and picked it up again, studying Marcus's face with an expression that was sad but no longer devastated. He would have liked you, he said, echoing what he'd told me earlier. He always said I needed to talk to people more, that I was too good at building walls. What was he like? I asked, settling onto one end of his couch. I mean, if you want to talk about him. James sat down on the other end, leaving space between us but angling his body toward mine. He was everything I'm not. Outgoing, optimistic, spontaneous. He could talk to anyone about anything. I used to watch him at parties and wonder what he saw in someone as serious as me. What did he see in you? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. He said I was his anchor, James said finally, that I kept him grounded when his enthusiasm ran away with him. He said I saw things he missed, thought about things he didn't have patience for. He smiled, just slightly. We balanced each other out. That sounds perfect. It wasn't perfect, James said, but there was warmth in his voice. We fought about stupid things. He was terrible with money, and I'm obsessive about keeping the apartment clean. He wanted to travel everywhere, and I liked having a routine. But somehow, we made it work. I found myself imagining their life together, Marcus's energy bumping up against James's careful control, two people learning to accommodate each other's quirks and needs. It sounded beautiful and complicated and real in a way that made me ache with longing for something I'd never had. "Do you miss the fighting?" I asked. James laughed, a sound that was surprised and genuine. "Yeah, actually. Isn't that weird? I miss the way he'd leave his socks on the bathroom floor and how he'd start 3 different projects and never finish any of them. I miss having someone to be annoyed with." "I don't think that's weird," I said. "I think that's love. Missing the whole person, not just the good parts." He looked at me then with an expression that was soft and grateful and something else that made my breath catch. "You have a way of saying things," he said quietly, "of seeing things clearly." "I don't feel clear about anything," I admitted. "Maybe that's why you can see clearly. Because you're not pretending to have all the answers." The rain had picked up again outside, drumming steadily against the windows, and the sound created a cocoon of intimacy around us. James reached for the remote with his good hand, but instead of turning on the TV, he just held it as if he was using it as a prop to think. "Can I tell you something?" he said finally. "Of course. Tonight, when you knocked on my door, it was the first time in 5 years that someone has been in this apartment who wasn't a delivery person or a maintenance worker." He looked down at the remote in his hands. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone to talk to. Someone who wanted to listen." The admission hit me with its quiet devastation. 5 years of isolation. 5 years of coming home to silence and eating dinner alone and having no one to share the small moments that make up a life. "That's going to change now," I said, and realized as I said it that I was making a promise. "Is it?" There was hope in his voice, but also wariness, as if he was afraid to believe that this moment might be the beginning of something instead of just a brief interruption in his solitude. "If you want it to," I said carefully. "I mean, I'd like to see you again, to talk like this again." Something shifted in his expression, a kind of cautious wonder that made me want to reach out and touch him. "I'd like that too," he said quietly. "More than I probably should." "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I mean, I've gotten used to being alone. Gotten good at it, even. And you're dangerous to that." "Dangerous how?" "You make me remember what I've been missing." The words hung between us, loaded with meaning and possibility, and the fragile hope of 2 people who had been afraid to want anything for too long. I could feel something shifting, some invisible barrier dissolving, as if we were both finally admitting to wanting the same thing. Without really deciding to do it, I shifted closer on the couch, closing some of the careful distance James had maintained. He noticed the movement immediately, his gaze flickering to mine and then away, but he didn't move back. "Is this okay?" I asked quietly. He nodded, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself carefully controlled. "You don't have to be careful with me," he said suddenly. "I mean, you don't have to treat me like I'm going to break. Everyone does that now, and I hate it." "I don't think you're going to break," I said honestly. "I think you're stronger than you give yourself credit for." "What makes you think that?" "You're here," I said simply. "You survived losing everything that mattered to you, and you're still here. Still capable of letting a stranger into your apartment, still willing to share your story. That takes strength." He looked at me then with an expression that was so raw and grateful it made my throat tighten. "No one's ever said that to me before," he said quietly. "It's true." We sat in silence for a moment, the space between us charged with something I didn't have words for. I was acutely aware of everything, the way his injured hand was resting on the couch cushion between us, the way his breathing had changed, the way the air itself seemed to be waiting for something to happen. "Michael," he said, and hearing my name in his voice did something strange to my pulse. "Yeah. Thank you. For tonight. For listening. For staying. For seeing me." There was something in his voice that made me look at him more closely, and what I saw in his expression made my breath catch. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, more complicated. Recognition, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that what was happening between us was more than just two lonely people finding temporary comfort in each other's company. "James," I said, not sure what I was going to say next. But he was already moving, shifting closer on the couch until our knees were almost touching. His good hand came up to touch my face, just briefly. A gentle brush of fingers against my cheek that made me close my eyes involuntarily. "Is this okay?" he asked, echoing my earlier question. I opened my eyes and found him watching me with an intensity that should have been overwhelming but somehow wasn't. "Yes," I whispered, and the word came out rough with wanting. He leaned closer, slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. But I didn't want to pull away. I wanted to close the distance between us, wanted to find out what it would feel like to be held by someone who understood loneliness from the inside out. When he kissed me, it was soft and hesitant and achingly gentle. A question more than a statement, an exploration rather than a claim. I could taste coffee on his lips, could feel the slight tremor in his hand where it cupped my face, could hear the way his breathing changed when I kissed him back. It lasted only a moment before he pulled away, searching my face for some sign of how I was feeling. What he saw there must have reassured him, because something in his expression relaxed. "Was that—" he started, then seemed to lose the words. "Perfect," I said, and meant it more than I'd ever meant anything. He smiled then, the first completely unguarded smile I'd seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. For a moment I could see what he must have looked like with Marcus, what happiness had done to his features before grief carved new lines around his eyes. "I haven't done that in a long time," he admitted. "Me neither," I said, though for different reasons. He studied my face, and I could see him processing the implications of that admission. "How long?" he asked gently. "A year, maybe longer." I felt heat rise in my cheeks. "I'm not very good at connecting with people." "You're connecting with me." The simple statement hit me with unexpected force. Because he was right. Whatever this was, whatever was happening between us, it felt more real and immediate than anything I'd experienced in years. "Yeah," I said softly. "I am." He reached for my hand then, carefully threading our fingers together. His palm was warm against mine, and I could feel his pulse through the thin skin at his wrist. "I'm scared," he said quietly. "Of what?" "Of wanting this too much. Of forgetting how to be alone again." He looked down at our joined hands. "Of dishonoring Marcus's memory by feeling something for someone else." The honesty of his fear hit me squarely in the chest. I wanted to tell him that loving someone new didn't mean loving someone less, that the heart wasn't a finite resource that got used up. But what did I know about love that deep, that transformative? What did I know about grieving someone who had been the center of your universe? "What do you think Marcus would want for you?" I asked instead. James was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. "He'd want me to be happy," he said finally. "He used to joke that if anything happened to him, I'd better not spend the rest of my life moping around feeling sorry for myself." His voice caught slightly. "He made me promise, actually. Made me promise I wouldn't give up on life." "Have you been keeping that promise?" "Not very well," James admitted. "Until tonight, maybe." Something in his voice made me look at him more closely, and what I saw there made my heart skip a beat. He was looking at me like I was something precious, something worth holding on to. "James," I said, not sure what I wanted to say next. But he squeezed my hand gently, and I could see in his expression that he understood what I couldn't put into words. "I know," he said quietly. "I feel it too." We sat there in the quiet of his living room, holding hands like teenagers, and I marveled at how something so simple could feel so monumental. Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, but inside, something else was gathering strength. "Will you stay?" he asked suddenly, the words coming out in a rush. "I mean, it's late and the rain, and I have a couch you could sleep on if you wanted to stay." The invitation was casual on the surface, but I could hear the deeper current running underneath it. He wasn't just asking me to avoid driving in bad weather. He was asking me not to leave, not to let this moment end and risk having it feel like a dream in the morning light. "I'd like that," I said, and watched relief flicker across his features. "I can get you a pillow, some blankets." "James," I said gently, interrupting his nervous planning. "It's okay. We don't have to figure out all the details right now." He nodded, but I could see he was still processing everything that had happened, still trying to understand how a simple power outage had led to this moment of connection. "This is crazy," he said, but he was smiling as he said it. "Good crazy or bad crazy?" "Good crazy," he said without hesitation. "Definitely good crazy." I leaned closer then, drawn by the warmth in his voice and the way he was looking at me. This time when we kissed, there was less hesitation, more certainty. His hand came up to cup the back of my neck, and I could feel the careful strength in his fingers, the way he was holding me like something he didn't want to let go of. When we broke apart, we were both breathing harder, and the space between us had somehow disappeared entirely. I was acutely aware of his body next to mine, the warmth radiating from his skin, the way his eyes had gone dark with something I recognized in my own pulse. "We should probably slow down," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Probably," I agreed, but I didn't move away. Instead, I found myself studying his face in the lamplight, cataloging the details I wanted to remember, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the small lines around his eyes that spoke to years of laughter and worry in equal measure, the careful way he was watching me as if he couldn't quite believe I was real. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "That I don't want this night to end," I admitted. "It doesn't have to," he said, and there was something almost shy in his voice. "I mean, you're staying, right? We have all the time we want." The promise in his words made something warm unfurl in my chest. All the time we want. When was the last time anyone had offered me that kind of spaciousness, that freedom from the constant pressure to rush toward some predetermined outcome? "What do you want to do with all that time?" I asked. He smiled, and this time it was completely unguarded, full of a wonder that made him look younger. "Everything," he said simply. "I want to know everything about you. What you do for work, what kind of books you read, whether you're a morning person or a night owl, what makes you laugh, what makes you sad, what you dream about when you can't sleep." The intensity of his curiosity should have been overwhelming, but instead it felt like coming home to something I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking. "That's a lot of questions," I said, but I was smiling too. "We have all night," he said, and the simple statement felt like a promise. So I told him. Sitting there on his couch with our hands still intertwined, I told him about my job in graphic design, how I'd fallen into it almost by accident, but found I loved the puzzle of making complex information beautiful and clear. I told him about the books I read, mostly literary fiction and poetry, though I had a secret weakness for science fiction that I rarely admitted to anyone. I told him I was definitely a night owl, that my best ideas came after midnight when the world was quiet enough for me to hear myself think. And he listened. Really listened, asking follow-up questions that showed he was paying attention not just to what I was saying, but to what I wasn't saying, the spaces between words where meaning lived. When it was his turn, he told me about his work as a freelance editor, how he'd built his business slowly over the years working with small publishers and academic presses. He told me about his love of poetry, particularly the kind of stark, honest verse that didn't shy away from difficult emotions. He told me he was an early riser by habit but a night owl by nature, that he'd trained himself to function on morning schedules but felt most like himself in the hours after dark. "That's when I do my best work," he said, "when the rest of the world is asleep and I can think clearly." "Is that why your light is always on so late?" I asked. "Partly, but also because—" He paused, looking almost embarrassed. "Because the nights are the hardest. During the day, I can stay busy, distracted, but at night, when everything gets quiet, that's when I miss him most." The admission was so honest it made my chest ache. I squeezed his hand gently, not trusting myself to speak. "I used to read to him," James continued quietly, "when he was sick toward the end. He couldn't sleep much, and the medications made it hard for him to focus on books himself. So I'd read to him. Poetry mostly, or short stories. Sometimes I'd just make things up, rambling stories about places we'd never been." "What kind of stories?" "Happy ones," he said simply. "Stories where people got to grow old together, where love was enough to fix everything." He looked down at our joined hands. "I haven't read out loud since he died. Haven't been able to." Something about the way he said it made me understand that this was more than just a casual observation. It was a loss within a loss, another piece of himself that had died with Marcus. "Maybe someday you'll want to again," I said carefully. He looked up at me then, and there was something almost hopeful in his expression. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Maybe with the right person." The implication hung between us, unspoken but present nonetheless. I felt something shift inside me, a sense of possibility I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. We talked until the rain stopped completely, until the only sounds were our voices and the occasional car passing on the street outside. Gradually, without either of us deciding it consciously, we moved closer together on the couch. First, just our knees touching, then his arm around my shoulders, then my head resting against his chest while he played absently with my hair. It should have felt rushed, too intimate for two people who had been strangers a few hours before. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if we were simply returning to a position we'd held countless times before. "This is nice," he said softly, and I could feel the words rumbling in his chest. "Yeah," I agreed, surprised by how right it felt to be held like this. I could hear his heartbeat through his t-shirt, steady and strong, and the sound was oddly comforting. When was the last time I'd been close enough to another person to hear their heartbeat? When was the last time I'd felt this kind of simple physical comfort? "Michael?" James's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Thank you." "For what?" "For staying. For listening. For—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "For making me remember that I'm still alive." The words hit me with unexpected force, and I lifted my head to look at him. His expression was soft and grateful, and something else that made my throat tighten with emotion. "You're not just alive," I said quietly. "You're here. Present. Real." I reached up to touch his face, mirroring the gesture he'd made earlier. "You're the most real thing that's happened to me in years." Something shifted in his expression, a kind of wonder that made him look almost young. And then he was kissing me again, deeper this time, with a hunger that spoke to months or years of deprivation. I kissed him back with equal intensity, pouring all the loneliness and longing of the past year into the connection between us. When we broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and the careful control we'd been maintaining had dissolved completely. "I should probably get those blankets," James said, but he made no move to get up. "Probably," I agreed, but I didn't move either. Instead, we stayed there on his couch, holding each other in the lamplight while the city settled into sleep around us. At some point, exhaustion began to creep in around the edges of our conversation, and our words came more slowly, with longer pauses between them. "I'm not used to this," James said quietly, his voice thick with approaching sleep. "Used to what?" "Feeling hopeful." The simple admission made something in my chest squeeze tight. I pressed closer against him, wanting to offer whatever comfort I could. "Is that what this is?" I asked. "Hope?" "Yeah," he said, and I could feel him smiling against the top of my head. "I think it is." I must have dozed off then, because the next thing I was aware of was James gently shaking my shoulder. "Hey," he said softly. "Do you want to move to the bedroom? You'll be more comfortable." I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented. The lamp was still on, and outside the windows the world had gone quiet except for the distant hum of late-night traffic. "What time is it?" I asked. "Almost 3, James said. "But you don't have to move if you don't want to." I just thought. "The bedroom sounds good," I said, sitting up slowly. My neck was stiff from the angle I'd been sleeping at, but I felt more rested than I had in weeks. James stood and offered me his hand, pulling me up from the couch. For a moment we stood there facing each other in the lamplight, and I was struck again by how much had changed in the space of a few hours. This morning, he'd been a stranger. Now he was someone who'd seen me cry, someone whose heartbeat I'd fallen asleep to. "This way," he said, leading me down a short hallway to his bedroom. The room was as spare as the rest of the apartment, but it felt more personal somehow. A double bed with white sheets, a dresser with a few scattered items on top, a nightstand with a small reading lamp and a stack of books. What struck me most was how clearly it was a bed meant for one person. One pillow, one side of the covers turned down, one book marked with a bookmark. "I can sleep on the couch," I offered, suddenly aware that I was intruding on his most private space. "Don't be ridiculous," James said, but I could hear the nervousness in his voice. "The bed's big enough for both of us. If you're comfortable with that." I looked at him, this man who had shared his deepest grief with me, who had kissed me with a hunger that spoke to years of loneliness, who was now offering to share his bed with the careful politeness of someone who didn't want to assume too much. "I'm comfortable with that," I said quietly. He nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "There's a spare toothbrush in the bathroom if you want it, and I can lend you something to sleep in if you'd like." The domesticity of the offer, sharing toothbrushes, borrowing clothes, felt both intimate and strangely normal, as if we were already something more than whatever we actually were. "That would be great," I said. He disappeared into his closet and returned with a soft gray t-shirt and a pair of pajama pants. "These might be a little big," he said, handing them to me. "Perfect," I said, accepting the clothes. They smelled like him. Clean laundry and something indefinably masculine that made me want to bury my face in the fabric. We took turns in the bathroom, and there was something almost ritualistic about it, the careful choreography of two people learning to navigate shared space. When it was my turn, I caught sight of myself in his mirror and was surprised by what I saw. My hair was messed up and my eyes were bright with something I didn't immediately recognize. It took me a moment to identify it as happiness. When I came back to the bedroom, James was already under the covers, reading by the light of his bedside lamp. He looked up when I entered, and I caught a glimpse of vulnerability in his expression before he smiled. "Feel better?" he asked, closing his book and setting it aside. "Much," I said, though I felt suddenly awkward standing there in his borrowed clothes. The t-shirt was indeed too big, hanging loose on my frame, and the pajama pants were soft and worn in a way that spoke to years of comfortable nights. James pulled back the covers on the other side of the bed, a gesture that was both invitation and question. I slid in beside him, hyper-aware of the warmth radiating from his body and the way the mattress dipped slightly under our combined weight. "This is strange," I said quietly, staring up at the ceiling. "Good strange or bad strange?" he asked, echoing my earlier question. "Good strange," I said, turning my head to look at him. "Definitely good strange." He smiled, and in the soft light of the bedside lamp he looked younger somehow, more at peace than I'd seen him all evening. "I keep waiting for my anxiety to kick in," he admitted, "for my brain to start cataloging all the reasons this is a terrible idea. And it's not happening. For the first time in years, my head is quiet." I understood exactly what he meant. The constant chatter of self-doubt and worry that usually filled my thoughts had gone silent, replaced by something that felt like contentment. "Mine too," I said. James reached over and turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the curtains. In the sudden intimacy of the darkness, I became acutely aware of everything: his breathing, the rustle of sheets when he moved, the warmth of his presence beside me. "Michael?" His voice was soft in the darkness. "Yeah. Thank you. For tonight. For staying. Thank you for asking me to." We lay there in comfortable silence, and I found myself listening to the rhythm of his breathing, the way it gradually slowed as he relaxed. I thought he might be falling asleep when he spoke again. "I used to be afraid of the dark," he said quietly. "After Marcus died, the nights were the worst part. I turned toward him, though I could barely make out his profile in the dim light. And now? Now it feels peaceful. Having someone here." The simple admission made something in my chest tighten with emotion. I reached out carefully, finding his hand under the covers and threading our fingers together. "I'm glad I'm here," I said. He squeezed my hand gently, and I felt him shift closer, closing the careful distance he'd maintained. Soon I could feel the warmth of his body against mine, could smell the clean scent of his soap, and something underneath that was uniquely him. "Is this okay?" he whispered. "More than okay," I whispered back. And it was. Lying there in the darkness with James beside me, holding hands like we were sharing some precious secret, I felt more at home than I had in my own apartment, more connected to another human being than I'd felt in years. "I haven't shared a bed with anyone since Marcus," James said quietly, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. The admission was huge, I realized. Not just the physical intimacy of it, but the trust it represented, the willingness to be vulnerable with someone new. "I haven't shared a bed with anyone in over a year," I admitted. "And even then, it wasn't like this." What was it like? I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Lonely," I said finally. "Even when I wasn't alone." James was quiet for a moment, processing that. "I know that feeling," he said. "Being lonely even when you're with someone. It's worse than being alone in some ways." "Yeah," I agreed. "At least when you're actually alone, you're not pretending to be connected to someone." "Exactly." His thumb traced gentle circles on the back of my hand. "This doesn't feel like pretending." "No," I said, struck by how right he was. "It doesn't." We fell into silence again, but it was different now. Deeper, more intimate. I could feel myself relaxing in ways I hadn't allowed myself to relax in months, maybe years. The constant vigilance I maintained, the careful monitoring of my own emotions and reactions, had gone quiet. "James?" I said softly. "Yeah?" "What happens tomorrow?" It was the question I'd been afraid to ask, the one that threatened to break the spell of whatever this was we'd found together. "I don't know," he said honestly. "What do you want to happen?" I paused, trying to find words for feelings I wasn't sure I understood yet. "I want this to be the beginning of something, not just a one-time thing. I felt him turn toward me in the darkness, could sense the intensity of his gaze even though I couldn't see his face clearly. "So do I," he said quietly. "More than I probably should." "Why more than you should?" "Because I'm terrified of wanting something this much. Of letting myself hope again." The raw honesty in his voice made my throat tighten. I understood that fear, even if my own came from different sources. The fear of wanting something so much that losing it would be devastating. "Maybe we don't have to figure it all out tonight," I said carefully. "Maybe we can just see what happens. Take it one day at a time. One day at a time." I felt some of the tension leave his body at my words, as if I'd given him permission to want this without having to have all the answers. "I'd like that," he said softly. "Good," I said, surprised by the relief in my own voice, "because I would too." He shifted closer then, and I could feel his breath warm against my forehead. Without really thinking about it, I moved closer too, until we were curled together in the center of the bed, holding each other in the darkness. "This is nice," James murmured against my hair. "Yeah," I agreed, marveling at how right it felt to be held like this. His hand traced gentle patterns on my back, and I found myself relaxing even further, my body molding itself to his warmth. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this safe, this comfortable in my own skin. "Michael." His voice was getting drowsy now. Sweet dreams." "You too," I whispered back, though I was already half asleep. I woke up to pale morning light filtering through the curtains and the realization that sometime during the night we'd moved even closer together. James's arm was around me, my head was pillowed on his shoulder, and one of my legs was tangled between his. For a moment I just lay there, savoring the warmth and closeness before the reality of morning could intrude. James was still asleep, his face relaxed in a way that made him look younger. There was no tension in his features, no carefully maintained control. Just peace, and something that might have been happiness. I didn't want to wake him, didn't want to break the spell of whatever we'd found together in the darkness. But as I lay there watching him sleep, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The desire to see someone again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. The thought should have terrified me. Instead, it filled me with a quiet joy that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. James stirred beside me, his arm tightening around me briefly before his eyes fluttered open. When he saw me watching him, he smiled, a soft, unguarded expression that made something in my chest flutter. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," I replied, struck by the domesticity of the moment. We lay there looking at each other, both of us seeming to memorize the details of this morning, this moment of quiet intimacy before the world intruded. "How did you sleep?" James asked. "Better than I have in months," I admitted. "You?" "Same." His hand found mine under the covers, threading our fingers together. "I didn't have any nightmares." The simple statement carried so much weight I could feel it settling between us. How long had he been having nightmares? How many nights had he woken up alone, grieving and afraid? "I'm glad," I said quietly. "Me too." We lay there in comfortable silence, neither of us seeming eager to break the intimacy of the morning. Outside, I could hear the city waking up, distant traffic, the sound of someone starting their car, the everyday sounds of people beginning their days. "What time is it?" I asked eventually. James reached for his phone on the nightstand, squinting at the screen. "Just after 7. "I should probably get going," I said, though I made no move to leave. "Let you have your morning routine back." "Actually," James said, and I could hear something almost shy in his voice, "I was wondering if you might want to have breakfast." "I make decent pancakes." The invitation was simple, but I could hear the hope underneath it, the desire to extend whatever this was for a little longer. "I'd love that," I said, and watched relief flicker across his features. "Good," he said, smiling. "Great." But neither of us moved to get up. Instead, we stayed there in his bed, holding hands and talking quietly about inconsequential things, what we usually had for breakfast, whether we preferred coffee or tea, the way the morning light looked different in his bedroom than in mine. Eventually, hunger forced us out of bed, and I followed James to the kitchen, still wearing his borrowed clothes. There was something intimate about making breakfast together, the easy choreography of two people learning to share space. James moved around his kitchen with practiced efficiency, while I set the table and made coffee, and it felt like we'd been doing this for years instead of hours. "So," James said as he flipped pancakes with his good hand, his injured palm still carefully bandaged, "what do you usually do on Saturday mornings?" "Laundry," I admitted, feeling suddenly embarrassed by the mundane reality of my weekend routine. "Grocery shopping. Sometimes I go for a walk if the weather's nice." "That sounds nice, actually." "Peaceful. What about you?" "Reading, mostly. Sometimes I work if I have a deadline." He glanced at me. "It gets pretty quiet here on weekends." I understood what he wasn't saying, that the weekends were probably the hardest. All those empty hours stretching ahead with no structure to fill them. "Well," I said carefully, "if you ever want company for the quiet parts, I'm next door." He looked at me then with an expression that was grateful and surprised, and something else that made my heart skip. "I might take you up on that," he said softly. "I hope you do." We ate breakfast in comfortable conversation, talking about books and work and the little details of our lives that had seemed too personal to share the night before, but now felt natural to reveal. I learned that James preferred his coffee black, that he had a secret addiction to cooking shows, that he'd been thinking about getting a cat but hadn't been able to bring himself to take that step. "What's stopping you?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, cutting his pancakes into precise squares. Commitment, I guess. Taking responsibility for another living thing. What if I'm not ready? What if I can't handle it? I heard the deeper question underneath the practical concerns, the fear that loving something again would make him vulnerable to loss again. "Maybe you don't have to be ready," I said carefully. "Maybe you just have to be willing." He looked up at me, and I could see him processing the implication of my words. "Is that what you're doing?" he asked quietly. "Being willing?" The question caught me off guard with its directness, but I found I had an answer ready. "Yeah," I said. "I think I am." Something shifted in his expression, a kind of wonder that made him look almost young. "Me too," he said quietly. "I think I am too." After breakfast, I reluctantly gathered my things, knowing I needed to go home and deal with the practical realities of my own life. But as I stood in his doorway, fully dressed in my own clothes from the night before, neither of us seemed eager for me to leave. "So," James said, leaning against the doorframe with his good arm, "what now?" "Now I go home and pretend to do laundry while actually thinking about last night," I said honestly. He smiled. "And I'll sit here and pretend to read while actually thinking about last night." "We're pathetic," I said, but I was smiling too. "Completely pathetic," he agreed. "I like it." I stepped closer, drawn by the warmth in his voice and the way he was looking at me. When I kissed him goodbye, it was soft and sweet and full of promise. "I'll see you soon?" I asked when we broke apart. "Very soon," he said, and the certainty in his voice made something warm unfurl in my chest. I walked the 10 feet to my own door feeling like I was floating, like the ground had become something insubstantial and magical. Inside my apartment, everything looked exactly the same as it had the night before, but somehow it all felt different. The silence that had once felt oppressive now felt peaceful. The space that had once felt empty now felt full of possibility. I made myself busy with actual laundry and grocery shopping, but James was right. I couldn't stop thinking about the night before. The way he'd looked at me by lamplight, the sound of his heartbeat under my ear, the gentle weight of his arm around me as I fell asleep. The way he'd said my name like it was something precious. Around noon, there was a soft knock on my door. When I opened it, James was standing there with a small pot of coffee and 2 mugs. "I thought you might want some coffee," he said, and I could see the nervous hope in his expression. "The good kind, from the coffee shop down the street." "That sounds perfect," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He handed me a mug and we settled on my couch, which suddenly felt too small and too far apart all at once. But when he reached for my hand, threading our fingers together like he had the night before, everything felt right again. "I couldn't concentrate on anything," he admitted, looking almost embarrassed by the confession. "Me neither," I said. "I kept thinking about you." "Good thoughts, I hope?" "The best thoughts," I said honestly. We spent the afternoon together, talking and sharing coffee and learning the shape of each other's presence in daylight. When evening came, neither of us mentioned him going back to his own apartment. Instead, he helped me make dinner, and we ate it while watching a movie. And when it got late, it seemed natural for him to stay again. This time, when we climbed into bed together, there was less hesitation and more certainty. We fell asleep holding each other, and I woke up feeling like I was exactly where I belonged. It went on like that for days, then weeks. James would bring coffee in the mornings, and I'd make dinner in the evenings, and gradually the boundaries between his space and mine began to blur. We developed routines without discussing them, small intimacies that felt as natural as breathing. But it wasn't just the domestic comfort that drew me to him. It was the way he listened when I talked about my work, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was really paying attention. It was the way he'd read to me sometimes in the evenings, his voice warm and measured as he brought poetry to life. It was the way he'd hold my hand during movies, absently tracing patterns on my palm while his attention was elsewhere. It was the way he looked at me sometimes, like I was something miraculous he couldn't quite believe he was allowed to have. 3 weeks after that first rainy night, I woke up in his bed to find him already awake, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "What?" I asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he said, but he was smiling. "I was just thinking." "About what?" "About how quiet my head has been lately. How settled I feel." I understood what he meant. The constant low-level anxiety that had been my companion for years had faded to almost nothing. I felt calmer, more centered than I had in longer than I could remember. "Is that okay?" I asked carefully, remembering his earlier fears about dishonoring Marcus's memory. James was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "I think Marcus would be happy," he said finally. "He always said the worst thing about dying wouldn't be being dead, it would be leaving me behind to be miserable. He made me promise I wouldn't spend the rest of my life grieving." "And you haven't been?" "No," James said, and there was wonder in his voice. "I've been living." The simple statement hit me with unexpected force. Because he was right. What we'd found together wasn't just comfort or distraction from loneliness. It was life, full and real and present. "So have I realized, saying the words out loud for the first time. James leaned over and kissed me then, soft and sweet, and full of promises I was finally brave enough to believe in. "I love you," he said against my lips, the words so quiet I almost didn't hear them. But I did hear them, and they didn't scare me the way I thought they would. Instead, they filled me with a joy so pure it felt like sunlight. "I love you too," I said, and meant it more than I'd ever meant anything in my life. Outside, it had started to rain again, the same steady drumming against the windows that had brought us together that first night. But this time, Instead of highlighting our loneliness, it felt like a celebration. We had found each other in the storm, and now we were building something beautiful in its wake. Something that honored the past while embracing the future. Something that acknowledged grief while choosing joy. Something that felt like home. As James held me closer and the rain continued its gentle rhythm against the glass, I realized that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest gestures. A knock on a door, a willingness to help. The courage to stay when staying feels like the scariest thing you could do. Sometimes love begins not with fireworks or grand declarations, but with the simple decision to be present for another person's pain and to let them be present for yours. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that presence becomes something you can't imagine living without, something worth building a future around, something that changes your life forever. My lonely older neighbor changed my life. Forever. Gay Story. Part 2. The words hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. James stood there in the harsh brightness of his living room, the photograph of him and Marcus still resting on the coffee table where we'd placed it after cleaning up the glass. His injured hand was cradled against his chest, and there was something vulnerable in his posture that made my heart race. "You don't have to go yet, if you don't want to." The invitation was soft, almost whispered, but it echoed in the silence that followed like something much louder. I could hear my own breathing, could feel my pulse thrumming in my throat as I processed what he was asking. Not just to stay a little longer, but to step across some invisible line we'd been dancing around all evening. "I don't want to," I said finally, the words coming out rougher than I'd intended. "Go, I mean. I don't want to go." Something shifted in his expression. Relief, maybe, mixed with surprise that I'd actually said yes. But then we were both just standing there, the weight of the admission settling between us like something we could touch. The emergency that had brought us together was over. His hand was bandaged, the glass was cleaned up, the power was back on. There was no practical reason for me to stay anymore, except that neither of us wanted me to leave. "Good," James said quietly, and the simple word seemed to contain multitudes. I wasn't ready for this to end." "This?" He gestured vaguely between us, searching for words to describe something that didn't have a name yet. "Tonight. Talking to someone. Not being alone." I understood exactly what he meant, even if I couldn't articulate it any better than he could. The connection we'd stumbled into felt fragile and precious, like something that might disappear if we looked at it too directly. "Me neither," I admitted. But then we were both just standing there, uncertain about what came next. The adrenaline of the crisis had faded, leaving behind something more complex and harder to navigate. I was acutely aware of everything: the way the overhead lights cast shadows across his face, the sound of rain still pattering gently against the windows, the fact that we were two people who had been strangers a few hours ago and were now sharing something I didn't have words for. "I could make more coffee," James offered, and I could hear the nervousness in his voice. "Or tea. I think I have tea somewhere." "Coffee sounds good," I said, grateful for something concrete to focus on. He nodded and headed toward the kitchen, moving carefully to favor his injured hand. I followed at a respectful distance, not wanting to crowd him but reluctant to let too much space open up between us. His kitchen was as minimalist as the living room. White cabinets, black granite countertops, the basic appliances you'd expect in a bachelor's apartment. Everything was clean and organized, but there was something almost austere about it, as if he'd stripped away anything that might remind him of a different life. "I'm not much of a host," he said, opening cabinets one-handed while trying to keep his bandaged palm elevated. "I don't usually have people over." "When was the last time?" I asked, then immediately regretted the question when I saw his face tighten slightly. "Before Marcus died," he said quietly. "We used to have friends over all the time. Dinner parties, game nights, that kind of thing." He paused, staring into an open cabinet as if he'd forgotten what he was looking for. After he died, I just stopped. It felt wrong, having people in the space we'd shared. The raw honesty of the admission hit me square in the chest. I could picture it. This apartment full of laughter and conversation, James and Marcus hosting friends, sharing meals, building a life together. And then the silence that must have followed, the way grief could hollow out a home until it became just a place to exist instead of live. "I'm sorry," I said, meaning it more deeply than the words could convey. "It's okay," he said, but I could see that it wasn't, not entirely. "It's just strange. Having someone here again. Good, strange, but strange." I moved closer, reaching around him to get the coffee filters from the cabinet he'd been staring into. Our shoulders brushed as I did, and I felt him tense slightly at the contact before deliberately relaxing. "Here, let me," I said when I saw him struggling to measure coffee grounds with his good hand. "Thanks." He stepped back to give me room, but not so far that I couldn't feel the warmth radiating from his body. I keep forgetting about the hand. "How does it feel?" I asked, focusing on the familiar ritual of making coffee to avoid looking at him too directly. "Better." Throbbing a little, but not too bad. He flexed his fingers experimentally, wincing slightly. "Could have been much worse." "You should probably see a doctor tomorrow," I said, "just to make sure there's no glass I missed." "Probably." He was quiet for a moment, watching me work. "Thank you. For helping. I know you didn't have to." The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the silence with something other than the weight of everything we weren't saying. I turned to face him, leaning back against the counter, and found him studying my face with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. "What made you knock?" he asked suddenly. "What?" "On my door tonight. You could have just ignored the noise, minded your own business. Most people would have. It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. The easy answer was that I'd heard someone in distress and reacted instinctively. But standing there in his kitchen, surrounded by the domestic intimacy of making coffee together, I knew it was more complicated than that. "I've been alone for a long time," I said finally. I recognized the sound. What sound? Someone trying not to ask for help. He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing the implication of my words. That I understood something about pride and isolation, about the particular kind of stubbornness that keeps you suffering in silence rather than admitting you need another person. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long what?" "How long have you been alone?" The question caught me off guard with its directness, but something about the way he asked it, gentle, genuinely curious, made me want to answer honestly. "Really alone?" "Since I moved here 2 years ago, but even before that." I paused, searching for the right words. "I've always been good at keeping people at a distance. It's safer that way." "Safer how?" "If you don't let people get close, they can't leave. They can't decide you're not worth the effort." The words came out more bitter than I'd intended, revealing more about my own fears than I'd meant to share. But James didn't look uncomfortable or judgmental. Instead, his expression softened with something that looked like recognition. "I understand that," he said quietly. "The keeping people away part. Though for me it was more about not wanting to inflict my grief on anyone, not wanting to be the sad widower who brings down every conversation." The coffee maker finished its cycle with a final wheeze, and I busied myself pouring 2 mugs, grateful for something to do with my hands. When I offered him one, our fingers brushed briefly as he accepted it, and I felt that same electric awareness I'd noticed earlier. "Thank you," he said, and I wasn't sure if he meant for the coffee or for something else entirely. We made our way back to the living room, settling on opposite ends of his couch with careful distance between us. But even with the space, I could feel his presence like a magnetic pull, drawing my attention to the way he held his injured hand, the way he stared thoughtfully into his mug before taking a sip. "This is good coffee," I said, just to have something to say. "Marcus always said I made terrible coffee," James replied, then looked surprised that he'd mentioned Marcus so casually. "Sorry, I don't usually—" "You don't have to apologize for talking about him," I said gently. "He was part of your life. A big part." James looked at me with something that might have been gratitude. Most people get uncomfortable when I mention him. They change the subject or give me these pitying looks like I should be over it by now. "How long has it been?" 5 years this December." He took another sip of coffee, using the gesture to buy himself time. "Everyone kept telling me it would get easier. That time heals all wounds. All that bullshit. Did it? Get easier?" He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "Different," he said finally. "Not easier, just different. The sharp edges of it wore down, but it's still there. Always there. I thought about that, about the weight of carrying someone's absence with you everywhere you go." "What was he like?" The question seemed to surprise him. Most people, I imagined, probably avoided asking about Marcus, thinking it would be too painful to discuss. He was. James's face lit up slightly, the way it might when remembering something beautiful. He was everything I'm not. Outgoing, spontaneous, optimistic. He could make friends with anyone within 5 minutes of meeting them. He'd come home from the grocery store with 3 new phone numbers and invitations to dinner parties I'd never heard of. Despite the sadness underlying his words, I could hear the love there, the warmth of good memories. "Sounds like you balanced each other out," I said. "We did." He pushed me out of my comfort zone, made me try things I never would have tried on my own. And He paused, looking uncertain. "I guess I kept him grounded. Helped him think things through before he jumped into whatever crazy scheme he'd come up with." "That sounds perfect." "It wasn't perfect," James said, but there was warmth in his voice. "We fought about money. He was terrible with it, always buying things we couldn't afford because they made him happy. We fought about his family, who never quite accepted us. We fought about my tendency to overthink everything." He smiled slightly. "But even the fighting was good in a way. It meant we cared enough to disagree." I tried to imagine it, this life he'd had, full of the comfortable conflicts that come with truly knowing another person. It sounded messy and complicated and utterly foreign to my own careful existence. "Do you miss the fighting?" I asked. James laughed, a sound that was surprised and genuine. "God, yes. I miss having someone to be annoyed with. I miss having someone who'd steal the covers and leave dishes in the sink and forget to buy milk." His expression grew more serious. "I miss mattering enough to someone that they'd fight with me." The last part hit me harder than it should have, maybe because it articulated something I'd never been able to put into words. The loneliness wasn't just about being alone, it was about not mattering enough to anyone to warrant their full attention, their frustration, their care. "I've never had that," I admitted quietly. "Never had what?" "Someone who cared enough to fight with me. My relationships always stayed surface level. Polite, safe." James studied my face with that same intense focus I'd noticed before. "Why do you think that is?" The question was direct in a way that would normally make me deflect or change the subject. But something about the quiet intimacy of the moment, the way the rain continued its steady drumming against the windows, made me want to be honest. "I don't know," I said. "Fear, maybe. If you don't let people see the real you, they can't reject the real you. But they can't love the real you either." The words hung between us, simple and devastating in their truth. I stared down into my coffee mug, feeling suddenly exposed. "No," I said quietly. "They can't." We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The space between us on the couch felt simultaneously too far and not far enough, as if we were both fighting the urge to either move closer or retreat entirely. "Can I ask you something?" James said eventually. "Sure." "What do you want?" I mean, what do you want your life to look like? It was such a fundamental question, one that I realized I'd been avoiding for years. I'd gotten so focused on just getting through each day that I'd stopped thinking about what I actually wanted those days to add up to. "I don't know," I said honestly. I used to have plans, goals, but somewhere along the way I just started existing, getting by. "What kind of plans?" I thought back to the person I'd been in my early 20s, full of ambitions and certainty about how my life would unfold. I wanted to be successful at work, obviously. I wanted to travel, see the world. I wanted to find someone to share it all with. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Pretty standard stuff, really. What happened? Life, I guess. Work became just work instead of a career. Travel became something I'd do someday when I had more money or time or courage. And relationships. I shrugged. "Turns out I'm not very good at them. Or maybe you just haven't found the right person yet." There was something in his voice that made me look up at him, and what I saw in his expression made my breath catch. He was looking at me like he was seeing something I didn't know was visible, something that might be worth getting to know. "Maybe," I said softly, not trusting myself to say more. The silence that followed was different from the others we'd shared, charged with possibility and the weight of things we weren't quite ready to say out loud. I was acutely aware of everything: his breathing, the way his fingers drummed absently against his coffee mug, the fact that we were sitting close enough that I could reach out and touch him if I wanted to. And I did want to. That was the thing I was slowly admitting to myself, the truth I'd been dancing around all evening. I wanted to close the distance between us, wanted to find out what it would feel like to touch him with intention instead of accident. "Michael," James said quietly, and something in his voice made me look up at him. "Yeah? Thank you. For staying. For listening. For..." He seemed to struggle with the words. "For making me feel less alone." The gratitude in his voice was almost overwhelming. But underneath it, I heard something else. Something that sounded like hope, tentative and fragile but undeniably present. "Thank you for asking me to stay," I said. He smiled then, just slightly, and the expression transformed his entire face. "I almost didn't. Ask, I mean. I almost let you leave." "What changed your mind?" "You did." He set his coffee mug down on the table between us, the movement bringing him slightly closer. "The way you helped with my hand, the way you listened when I told you about Marcus. The way you looked at me like I was a person instead of just a problem to be managed." I knew exactly what he meant. How many conversations had I sat through where I could feel the other person waiting for their turn to talk, not really listening but just being polite? How many times had I done the same thing, gone through the motions of connection without actually connecting? "You are a person," I said. "A good person. Someone worth knowing." His eyes widened slightly at my words, as if no one had said anything like that to him in a very long time. "So are you," he said quietly. The simple affirmation hit me with unexpected force. When was the last time someone had seen something worthwhile in me? When was the last time I'd felt like I mattered to another person, even in some small way? Without quite meaning to, I shifted closer on the couch, closing some of the careful distance we'd been maintaining. James noticed the movement immediately, his gaze flickering to mine and then away, but he didn't move back. "Is this okay?" I asked quietly. He nodded, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was holding himself carefully controlled. "I haven't," he started, then stopped, looking uncertain. "Haven't what?" Haven't felt like this in a long time. Since Marcus. I didn't think I could. The admission was huge, I realized. Not just that he was attracted to me, but that he was capable of feeling attraction again. That whatever we were building together was awakening something in him that grief had put to sleep. "How does it feel?" I asked gently. "Terrifying," he said with a shaky laugh. "And good. Really good." I understood that combination of fear and excitement, the way wanting something could be both wonderful and terrifying at the same time. "I'm scared too," I admitted. "Of what?" "Of wanting this too much. Of hoping for something I might not be able to keep." James looked at me with such understanding that I felt something in my chest loosen. "Maybe we don't have to figure out the keeping part yet," he said carefully. "Maybe we can just be here. In this moment. Just this moment. Just this moment." It was such a simple concept, but revolutionary for someone like me who was always worrying about tomorrow, next week, next year. What would it be like to just exist in the present? To let myself want something without immediately calculating all the ways it could go wrong? "I'd like that," I said quietly. "Good," James said, and this time when he smiled, it was completely unguarded. I shifted closer again, and this time he moved to meet me, closing the distance between us until our knees were almost touching. The proximity made me hyper-aware of everything. The warmth radiating from his body, the way his breathing had quickened slightly, the fact that his injured hand was resting on the couch cushion between us. "Can I started, then stopped, not sure how to ask for what I wanted. "What?" Instead of answering with words, I reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted to. When he didn't, I covered his uninjured hand with mine, threading our fingers together. His skin was warm and slightly rough from years of work, and I could feel his pulse thrumming beneath my thumb where it rested against his wrist. Such a simple touch, but it sent electricity shooting up my arm. "Is this okay?" I asked, echoing his earlier question. "More than okay," he said, his voice rough with something I recognized in my own pulse. We sat there holding hands like teenagers, both of us staring down at our joined fingers as if they contained some kind of magic. Maybe they did. Maybe this was what connection felt like after years of careful isolation, electric and overwhelming and utterly necessary. "James," I said, not sure what I wanted to say next. He looked up at me, and what I saw in his expression made my breath catch. It wasn't just attraction, though that was certainly there. It was recognition, maybe, or the beginning of understanding that what was happening between us was more than just two lonely people finding temporary comfort. "I know," he said quietly, as if he could read my thoughts. "What do we do now?" "I don't know." He squeezed my hand gently. "I don't have a roadmap for this." "Me neither." "Want to figure it out together?" The question was simple on the surface, but I could hear the deeper current running underneath it. He wasn't just asking about tonight, about what came next in the immediate sense. He was asking if I was willing to step into something unknown with him, to risk the safety of isolation for the possibility of connection. "Yeah," I said, surprised by how certain I sounded. "I do." Something shifted in his expression, a kind of wonder that made him look almost young. And then he was leaning closer, moving slowly enough that I could have pulled away if I'd wanted to. But I didn't want to pull away. I wanted to meet him halfway, wanted to find out what it would feel like to be kissed by someone who understood loneliness from the inside out. When his lips touched mine, it was soft and hesitant and achingly gentle. A question more than a statement, an exploration rather than a claim. I could taste coffee on his lips, could feel the slight tremor in his hand where it came up to cup my face, could hear the way his breathing changed when I kissed him back. It lasted only a moment before he pulled away, searching my face for some sign of how I was feeling. What he saw there must have reassured him, because some of the tension left his shoulders. "Was that he started, then seemed to lose the words. Perfect, I said, and meant it more than I'd ever meant anything. He smiled then, the first completely unguarded smile I'd seen from him all evening, and it transformed his entire face. For a moment I could see what he must have looked like with Marcus, what happiness had done to his features before grief carved new lines around his eyes. I haven't done that in 5 years, he admitted. How did it feel? Like coming back to life. The raw honesty of his words hit me square in the chest. I understood exactly what he meant, because I felt it too. This sense of awakening, of parts of myself I'd forgotten existed stirring back to consciousness. For me too, I said quietly. He reached for my other hand then, holding both of them in his warm grip. I don't want to rush this, he said carefully. Whatever this is, we don't have to rush. But I also don't want to pretend it's not happening. No pretending, I agreed. We sat there looking at each other, both of us seeming to memorize this moment, this shift from whatever we'd been before to whatever we were becoming. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows, but inside, something else was falling into place. Are you tired? James asked eventually. The question was innocent enough, but something in his voice made me study his expression more closely. There was hope there, and nervousness, and something that looked like longing. Not really, I said honestly. Are you? No. I feel like I could stay up all night talking to you. The admission made something warm unfurl in my chest. When was the last time someone had felt that way about my company? When was the last time I'd felt that way about anyone else's? What would you want to talk about? I asked. Everything, he said simply. I want to know everything about you. What you were like as a kid, what your family is like, what makes you laugh, what makes you sad, what you dream about, what you're afraid of. The intensity of his curiosity should have been overwhelming, but instead it felt like coming home to something I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking. That's a lot of questions, I said, but I was smiling. We have all night, he said, and the simple statement felt like a promise. So I told him. Curled up on his couch with our hands still intertwined, I told him about growing up in a small town where being different meant being invisible. I told him about my parents, who loved me in their careful, distant way, but never quite knew what to do with a son who read poetry and preferred solitude to sports. I told him about college, where I'd finally started to understand that there were other people like me in the world, but where I'd been too afraid to reach out and find them. I told him about the jobs I'd taken after graduation, each one a step toward financial stability, but away from the creative dreams I'd harbored as a young man. I told him about the relationships that had fizzled out because I'd never learned how to be vulnerable with another person, how to let someone see past the careful facade I presented to the world. And he listened. Really listened, asking follow-up questions that showed he was paying attention not just to what I was saying, but to what I wasn't saying, the spaces between words where meaning lived. When it was his turn, he told me about growing up as the quiet middle child in a family of extroverts, how he'd learned early that books were safer companions than people. He told me about college, where he'd met Marcus in a poetry workshop, and fallen in love not just with him, but with the idea that someone could see past his careful reserve to the person underneath. He told me about their life together, 8 years of building something real and complicated and beautiful. The apartment they'd shared, smaller than this one but filled with more laughter. The trips they'd planned and taken, the fights they'd had and resolved, the quiet domesticity that had felt like the foundation of everything. And then he told me about the cancer, the diagnosis that had come out of nowhere, the treatments that had stolen months of their time together, the gradual recognition that love wasn't going to be enough to save them. I was angry for a long time, he said quietly, staring down at our joined hands. At God, at the universe, at Marcus for leaving me, at myself for not being able to fix it. Are you still angry? Sometimes. But mostly I'm just tired. Tired of carrying it all alone. The exhaustion in his voice was palpable, and I found myself wanting to offer whatever comfort I could. You don't have to carry it alone anymore, I said gently. Not if you don't want to. He looked up at me then, and there was something almost desperate in his expression. What if I'm not ready? He asked. What if I can't be what you need? What if you can't be what I need? Or what if you can't be what you think I need? The distinction seemed to surprise him. What's the difference? Maybe I don't need you to be anything other than who you are right now. Maybe I don't need you to be healed or fixed or over your grief. Maybe I just need you to be willing to try. James stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing the implications of what I'd said. I can try, he said finally. I want to try. That's all I need, I said, and realized as I said it that it was true. The conversation gradually wound down as exhaustion began to creep in around the edges, but neither of us seemed eager to break the spell of intimacy we'd created. At some point, James suggested we watch something, more for the excuse to stay close than because either of us was particularly interested in television. He found an old movie on cable, something black and white that neither of us had seen before, and we settled back against the couch cushions to watch. But instead of sitting at opposite ends like we had earlier, we gravitated toward each other, until I was leaning against his shoulder and his arm was around me. It should have felt strange being held like this by someone I'd known for less than 12 hours. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, as if we were simply returning to a position we'd held countless times before. This is nice, James said softly, his breath warm against the top of my head. Yeah, I agreed, surprised by how right it felt to be held like this. I could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest, could hear his heartbeat through his shirt, and the sound was oddly comforting. The warmth of his body against mine, the gentle weight of his arm around my shoulders. It was more physical affection than I'd had in months, maybe years. Michael? His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Thank you. For tonight. For staying. For listening. For... He paused, seeming to search for the right words. For seeing me. I lifted my head to look at him, struck by the vulnerability in his expression. Thank you for letting me see you, I said. Something passed between us then, a recognition of what we'd shared and what we might be building together. It was too soon to call it love, too fragile to examine too closely. But it was real, and it was ours, and it was more than either of us had had in a very long time. I settled back against his shoulder and we turned our attention to the movie, though I found myself paying more attention to the feeling of being held than to whatever was happening on screen. At some point, James's hand found mine again, and we sat there in comfortable silence, fingers intertwined, watching shadows dance across his living room wall. The rain continued its gentle drumming against the windows, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the beating of our hearts. I felt my eyes growing heavy, lulled by the warmth and safety of James's embrace, but I fought against sleep, not wanting this moment to end. You can sleep if you want, James said quietly, as if he could sense my struggle. I don't want to miss anything, I mumbled against his shoulder. He chuckled, a sound I felt more than heard. I'll still be here when you wake up. The promise in his words made something warm and secure settle in my chest. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt safe enough to let my guard down completely, to stop monitoring and controlling every moment and just let myself exist. Promise? I asked, already half asleep. Promise, he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I drifted off sometime during the movie, still curled against James's side, still holding his hand. My last conscious thought was of how different everything felt from when I'd woken up that morning. How much larger and more possible the world had become in the space of a single evening. When I woke up, it was to the pale gray light of early dawn filtering through the windows and the realization that sometime during the night, we'd shifted position. I was lying on the couch with my head pillowed on James's lap, and his hand was resting gently on my shoulder. He was still asleep, his head tipped back against the cushions, his face peaceful in a way that made him look younger. For a moment, I just lay there, taking in the quiet domesticity of the scene. The movie had long since ended, and the television was showing some early morning talk show with the sound turned down low. The rain had stopped, and outside I could hear the first tentative sounds of the city waking up. Distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere, the everyday sounds of people beginning their days. But here, in James's living room, time felt suspended. We were existing in a bubble of possibility, a space between what had been and what might be. I didn't want to move, didn't want to risk breaking whatever spell had brought us to this moment. James stirred beneath me, his hand tightening briefly on my shoulder before he woke fully. When he realized where we were, how we'd ended up, a soft smile crossed his face. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," I replied, struck by the intimacy of the moment. We looked at each other in the pale morning light, both of us seeming to take stock of what had happened between us. In the clear light of day, it would have been easy to dismiss the previous night as an anomaly, two lonely people finding temporary comfort in each other's company. But looking at James's face, seeing the same wonder and recognition there that I felt in my own chest, I knew it had been more than that. "How did you sleep?" he asked. "Better than I have in months," I said honestly. "You?" "Same." His hand moved from my shoulder to brush gently through my hair, a touch so tender it made my throat tighten with emotion. "I didn't have any nightmares." The simple statement carried so much weight. How many nights had he woken up alone, grieving and afraid? How long had it been since he'd slept peacefully? "I'm glad," I said quietly. We stayed like that for a while, neither of us seeming eager to break the spell of the morning. But eventually, practical concerns intruded. I needed to use the bathroom, James's injured hand was stiff and sore, and we were both in need of coffee and something resembling breakfast. As I sat up, reluctantly leaving the warmth of his touch, I caught sight of myself in the reflection of his television screen. My hair was disheveled, my clothes were wrinkled from sleeping on the couch, and there were pillow creases on my cheek. I looked like exactly what I was, someone who'd spent the night somewhere he hadn't planned to be. But there was something else in my reflection that caught my attention, something I hadn't seen in a long time. I looked content, peaceful in a way that went deeper than just being well-rested. I looked like someone who'd found something he hadn't known he was looking for. "What?" James asked, noticing my expression. "Nothing," I said, but I was smiling. I looked different. Different how? I struggled to put it into words. Happier, maybe? More present. James studied my face with that same intense focus I'd noticed the night before. "You do look different," he said quietly. "You look like you belong here." The words hit me with unexpected force, not just because of what they implied about us, but because of what they revealed about me. How long had it been since I'd felt like I belonged anywhere? How long had I been drifting through life without any real sense of home or connection? "I feel like I belong here," I said, surprised by my own honesty. Something shifted in James's expression, a kind of cautious hope that made him look almost vulnerable. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like you to belong here." The admission hung between us, loaded with possibility and the fragile hope of two people who had been alone for too long. We were moving fast, maybe too fast, but neither of us seemed inclined to slow down. "What happens now?" I asked. Now you use my bathroom while I make coffee, James said practically. And then we figure out what comes next. It wasn't the most romantic answer, but somehow it was exactly what I needed to hear. We didn't have to solve everything this morning, didn't have to define what we were or make promises about the future. We could just be present for whatever was unfolding between us. By the time I returned from the bathroom, James had coffee brewing and was standing at his kitchen window, looking out at the city beyond. The early morning light caught the silver in his hair, and there was something contemplative about his posture that made me hesitate in the doorway. "Penny for your thoughts?" I said softly. He turned toward me, and I was relieved to see that his expression was calm, not troubled. "Just thinking about how different today feels from yesterday," he said. "How much can change in the space of one night?" I understood exactly what he meant. Yesterday morning, I'd been a lonely man going through